Welcome. My name's Captain Carrie Gandy, and this lesson is an introduction to the asset management principle of performance. In this lesson, we are going to understand why we measure infrastructure performance, explain how performance drives activity management decisions, know the civil engineer enterprise tool for performance measurement, including key performance indicators and AFCOLs. We're going to try to understand how to create performance metrics through the SMART acronym. And finally, we're going to comprehend the impacts of asset functionality on performance and ultimately the value an asset provides. So why do we measure performance? Throughout the civil engineer enterprise, we have all sorts of different metrics for how we measure performance, from installation health assessments to the weekly operations flight meeting slides, even down to the level where you have a technician who just verbally tells their super about asset performance. So, getting at why we measure these things, it should really inform our infrastructure decisions. Not just tell us, that we need to make a new slide deck or a dashboard. It needs to be something that's actionable, something that we can do about, something that we can do to change the performance metrics. So it all ties back to the asset management principle of value. Remember that performance is something that directly impacts the value that we get out of our assets. So let's stop making decisions and then measuring what happened afterwards, or maybe just do it less. And let's start making decisions based off of the performance that we measure. The first step in doing this is understanding what performance we're measuring. Remember that the discipline of asset management is done through the process of activity management. So when we measure things like asset performance or our ops flight performance, we're really just getting at a proxy for that activity performance. So I encourage you now, we're going to kind of create a mind map of how this all works out. So I encourage you to pause the video, and we're going to try and map out how this works. And I encourage you to do it for whatever part of the infrastructure or activity that it is important for you to measure. So if we have our activity, it's going to be filled with assets. Remember that an activity is a service or a portfolio of assets. If we're thinking of an asset portfolio, maybe we're talking about our facilities activity. All of these assets may be more or less independent of each other. But if we're thinking of an activity as a service, like we might do for the utilities activity, they might be connected in different ways. There also might be different assets in a different type of sub-activity that are connected, and they are all interdependent in some way or fashion. Think about how your activity, your part of the infrastructure, might be interdependent. Now, when we think about the outside things, so not just the asset performance that's in your activity, what affects your activity is largely going to be maintenance. So we think about preventive maintenance, which might happen to maybe certain types of your assets, but maybe not others. And then there's also corrective maintenance. So what needs fixing in your activity? Maybe some of your assets are undergoing corrective maintenance. Now, to get at that, you can measure operations flight performance to get at those things. But again, it's not going to be directly correlated to overall activity performance. It's going to have different relationships depending on how your activity is set up And of course, when we go to our engineering flight meetings and talk about opportunity or project performance, that's going to be related to our corrective maintenance. So they all have to do with each other. You can use them as a proxy measure for the overall performance of your activity, which is what we're ultimately getting at. But it's not perfect. So that's just something to realize as you go through this lesson and thinking about the performance metrics that you're currently measuring. So I also want to make a distinction that the performance of your activity is not necessarily a direct reflection on the activity manager. The same is true for sub-activities and their managers. Actually, at any point in the enterprise, no matter what your job is, it's hard to say that your performance is directly tied into infrastructure performance. There's a lot of contributing factors. So that's why it is so important to be honest. Some of us, especially with budget cuts in recent years, have been dealt a really bad hand when it comes to the condition of the assets in our activities, right? But we won't know how far this discipline of asset management can get us. We won't know how far you can get us in this process unless we're honest about our starting point, unless we're honest about our activity performance right now. So I encourage you to encourage honesty throughout this process and to anyone who is doing these performance metrics. I also want to say, many of you might be thinking, well, I don't know, Captain Gandy, I'm doing my best, but I'm just an average airman engineer. And my leadership, I can make the best recommendations for asset management to my leadership, but they're distracted with quality of life or an upcoming air show or whatever is bright and shiny that quarter. I understand. However, I want you to use your personal leadership as a capital A airman to advocate for the infrastructure and encourage data-driven decision making. Let's talk about some of the tools for the job when it comes to performance. So throughout this lesson, I'm going to talk about functionality, performance metrics, and level of service. And as an introduction, I want to let you know what is available throughout the enterprise to help inform your program. So in regards to functionality, there is an application in the Builder Sustainment Management System, but in the Air Force version of Builder, it is inactive. So you can't use the IT specifically, but what you can do is go to the Builder documentation or take one of our Builder Suite courses and use that information and how it calculates functionality to inform how you'll do it. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. In terms of performance metrics for built infrastructure, we are developing enterprise-wide key performance indicators. And by we, I mean specifically AFCEC COO and our enterprise activity managers at Air Force IMSC. For natural infrastructure, these are already pretty well developed. Many of our natural infrastructure performance metrics are already present in MGT and in the Environmental Management System, or EMS. So if the real estate and natural infrastructure activity is relevant to you, that's where you would look. Talking about level of service, our major tool is the Air Force Common Output Level Standards, or AFCOLS. If you're looking for these, there's a SharePoint for it. The AFCOLS portal SharePoint, I've provided it to you in your Resources tab in Canvas, so you can link right to it. On that link, I really encourage you to look at the Built Infrastructure Sustainment AFCOLS and also the Engineering Planning and Integration AFCOLS. It might be the most relevant in terms of built infrastructure asset management. So obviously, when you think about this and you think about the performance metrics that are going to be important for your activity, there are some gaps. And ultimately, filling those gaps is going to be up to you as an asset manager. So let's talk a little bit about how to do this yourself. The first one we'll talk about is functionality. So life changes, mission changes, sometimes our demographics and therefore our requirements change. And that's okay because we can adjust our facilities and some of our assets to meet that new mission requirement at the lowest cost possible. But it impacts functionality. So how do you measure that? I'm going to use this very simple example of what was obviously a men's restroom at McGuire Lakehurst Dix in the CE building, and now they've made it a women's restroom. Although this facility, it operates perfectly, it has great functionality as a men's restroom, because of the functional purpose, it sacrifices a little bit of performance in terms of a women's restroom because it has the urinal, a fixture we don't need, and it's taking up space. So ultimately, I'm asking you to measure functionality or get a feel, a qualitative measure of functionality because it underpins performance. So with that, I'll move on to performance metrics. So do-it-yourself performance metrics. The first one we're going to talk about, I already talked about how some enterprise-wide key performance indicators are in work at the enterprise level. But know that key performance indicators are all about how the organization is performing. Remember back to our mind map? That does impact our activity, but it's not directly proportional, so we want to remember that when we think about key performance indicators. What we recommend, what might be helpful to you in terms of key performance indicators, instead of looking at operation site performance overall, maybe look at it at the sub-activity level, that system level, and break it out by work prioritization. Why would we do that? So first of all, thinking about emergencies. If you have a lot of emergencies, and we qualify that as more than 4%, you might be being too reactive and you need to get on top of some corrective maintenance requirements before they become a problem. Also, of course, if your sub-activity has preventive maintenance requirements, we want to make sure that those are totally completed. Remember that preventive maintenance is our first type of scheduled work. We want it all to get done because that's what's going to keep your good assets good. And by comparison, you can look at the amount of corrective maintenance and also the type of corrective maintenance that's happening in your sub-activity. So in terms of key performance indicators, you could have more, but these are some that we recommend to get started. Other metrics for specifically asset performance are going to be a little bit more technical and depending on the asset. So I recommend that you reach out to the subject matter experts. If you are subject matter experts, I recommend that you get more perspectives as well to look at what some good metrics might be. So some examples. I already talked about in our restroom example, space utilization as an example of how we assess how well a facility meets our needs. Also, this is a unique one. Remember, we do it as a portfolio because facilities may not be directly interconnected in many cases, but the overall space utilization throughout all our facilities might let us know how we're doing and if we need some overall like domino plans, demolition, new facilities. So that might actually be a form of asset performance that rolls up in a nice even way where we can sum it to see activity performance. One that's more of system related is pavement ride quality and friction. This is something that's measured by the airfield pavement team when they come out for an evaluation, and also something that's going to be really important to airfield management. Another way we measure asset performance in terms of mechanical systems is going to be those industrial control systems. It might measure the performance of the system overall, or it might just be one really critical system in a larger network. So an example might be a water treatment plant that could be a single point of failure, so its performance directly impacts the rest of the system. Thinking about natural infrastructure, maybe one way you would think about it in terms of environmental is maybe you do species monitoring because that lets you know how well you're doing with your habitat protection program. Both this organizational performance through KPIs and your asset performance should be SMART. Now, of course, this is an Air Force course, so that's an acronym. What do I mean by SMART metric, target, and goal? Specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-based. And you'll notice that some of these can be related as well. By specific, I want you to remember those relationships that you mapped out. Are you measuring activity performance or the asset and organizational performance that contributes to it? You might use asset or organizational performance as a proxy because the overall activity performance is kind of hard to measure. And that brings me on to my next point. How will you measure it? Quantitatively, as in using numbers, or qualitatively, just the opposite? Is it trackable? And also, who is going to track it? Which brings me to my next point. If you're not the right person to track every metric, and I would guess, activities being so big, that you yourself are not the right person to track all of them if you are the activity manager, you're going to want to kind of farm those out into assignable places, thinking about how our organizational structure works. A way to do that is also to make sure that it's specific. You don't want one metric that encompasses things that are measured by environmental and ops and engineering, all in these different places to where you can't roll it up into one nice metric. You want to make sure that your metrics are realistic and time-based. These kind of go together because what's realistic might depend on your planning horizon, and it definitely has to do with the resources, the manpower, the funding that you have.